Hello and welcome. My name is Faye Augustin, and I am the Associate Director for Blue Trails for American Rivers. I'd like to welcome all of you to our July webinar, Building Support for Conservation Funding Initiatives, where we're highlighting the case study of Boise for clean water and open space. So if your connection is lost today at all, as always, please go ahead and log in again using your unique web link and passcode that was provided when you registered with GoToWebinar. As always, our webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Blue Trails Guide website at bluetrailsguide.org/blog next Monday, July 25th. And finally, if you have any other questions or continue to have any issues with technical support, please feel free to shoot me an email. My email is down at the bottom of the screen. So we really encourage, as all of you know, for you to ask any and all questions that you have throughout the webinar in the question box, which is in your GoToWebinar side panel at the bottom. You can type in your questions throughout the webinar, or you're welcome to save them until the end of the webinar. And we'll leave, sorry, that says 15, but that should say 5 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer as many questions as we can. And a transcript of all of these questions and their answers will also be available next Monday on the Blue Trails Guide blog. So that's next Monday, July 25th at bluetrailsguide.org/blog. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and turn it over to our speaker today. I'm really excited to have Kate Thorpe join us to speak more about the Boise for Clean Water and Open Space. Kate is the Deputy Director at Conservation Voters for Idaho, which is a Boise-based nonprofit that works to create the political environment to protect the natural environment by electing pro-conservation leaders, advocating for sound environmental policy, and holding leaders accountable for their votes relating to the environment. She also served as the Treasurer and Campaign Staff Member for the Boise for Clean Water and Open Space, a campaign that worked to pass a levy that will raise $10 million to protect clean water and open space in the City of Boise. She holds her master's in public administration with an emphasis in environmental and natural resource policy from Boise State University. Kate's an avid kayaker and enjoys spending her free time enjoying Idaho's rivers and waterways. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Kate. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Faye. Good morning, everyone. Like Faye said, my name is Kate Thorpe. And before I start, I just want to say thank you to American Rivers for giving me the opportunity to share this story. I put my picture up on the last slide so that you have a face for the voice that's really talking at you. It's really exciting to be able to present this webinar to all of you and have the opportunity to talk about this campaign. It was a really fun campaign to be involved in, and I really hope that the lessons we learned can help you build support for conservation funding initiatives in your own community. Faye, can you go back to the last slide? The controls aren't working for me. Okay. So before we dive in, I just wanted to give you an idea of what we'd be talking about. I will briefly give you some background info on Boise's open space history, then talk to you about the importance of choosing what type of election to pursue a funding initiative in. We'll talk about some of the early steps of the campaign, including conversations with the City of Boise and the polling that we did. Then I'll talk about how we used that polling to identify who our target voters were and develop a plan to get to our win number that included those voters. I'll discuss some of the strategies and tactics we used, what the results of those were, and then give you, in my opinion, a brief overview of what the takeaways from our campaign are. And at the very end, like Faye said, I'll take your questions and hopefully provide some informative answers. Next slide. So getting into it, last November, 74% of Boise voters voted in support of a 2-year temporary override levy, and that's a property tax, and it was to raise $10 million for open space protection, outdoor recreation, wildlife habitat, and clean water. And these funds will be used to protect places like the Boise River and the Boise foothills, which are pictured in this slide behind downtown Boise. They're absolutely beautiful, and we're lucky to have them. But how did we get to such high support numbers? For any of you who have worked in elections or even tried to organize a room full of people to agree on something, you know that 74% support is really hard to attain. So what I'm trying to address in this presentation is how did we see such overwhelming success in this measure, and what were the key points of the campaign that actually provided for that? Next slide. Boise is a city with a legacy of open space, and our campaign had the benefit of building off of a previously successful open space levy that passed here in 2001. And this created an open space success story in our community, where our foothills and the trail systems that are built through them is really considered a critical asset to our community. So to try to build upon that legacy, in 2013, there was an attempt to pass a second open space funding initiative, but this time it was in the form of a bond measure. And that attempt garnered over 60% of the vote, but failed to reach the supermajority needed to pass a bond in the state of Idaho. And that threshold is not common throughout the U.S., so many of your communities might have different thresholds for what it actually takes to pass a bond or a levy. And despite that bond being a failure, it did show that we had wide community support for conservation efforts. So at the conclusion of the 2013 bond effort, the conservation community really regrouped and looked at how we were going to work in the future to get this done and how we were going to raise money for the conservation priorities that needed to happen. And so we determined that the next best chance we would have would be in the 2015 November election. Next slide. So some of you might be asking yourself why we decided to wait until 2015 instead of just making another go at it in 2014. And that's actually a really important question for a planning funding initiative like this. And if you're considering running a campaign like this, that should be your first question, is what year do you do this? And so choosing to put it on the general ballot in an off-cycle year was strategic and the determining factor for how we ended up structuring our campaign and the tactics we chose to use. So the election type and year should be a part of your strategy, whether it's a primary or general in an on or off-cycle year. And I'm going to explain why. Next slide. So first of all, let me apologize for my infographics here. I'm not that handy with that software, but I tried. So here is an example of the voter universe during an on-cycle or even-numbered year. And so in these years, most federal, state legislative, and gubernatorial elections occur. So these are years like 2014 or 2016. And so during these years, we see higher voter turnout because of the fact that these positions are on the ballot. So for example, this year is obviously the presidential election, and in Idaho, we're likely to see 75% of registered voters actually cast a ballot. So if we were to run a levy during this type of year, our electorate would largely already be defined for us, and our margin for changing that election by turning out more of the people who naturally support our cause but are unlikely to vote would be fairly small. Next slide. So you can see the margin highlighted here in red. This means that because it's harder to turn people out in that red margin, you have to focus more on voter education and persuasion and less on actually getting out the vote. And that can make your campaign more expensive and less efficient. It's much harder to change people's votes than to get people to go to the polls that you know support you. Next slide. So looking at an off-year election like 2015, when we ran this levy, was off-year elections occur in odd-number years, and they rarely feature an election to a federal office. Very few state legislative elections happen at the time, and same with gubernatorial elections. Though your state might be different, you all will know your state voting policies better than I do. And so because of that, turnout is generally much lower because people aren't voting on these higher positions, and this leaves you more room to turn out the voters that you want to, who might actually be with you. And so in Boise's case, in 2015, we anticipated around 25% of registered voters actually casting a ballot. And so we were able to look inside that margin Next slide. At the 75% of voters who might vote in a presidential year, and so we could look at that margin and work to get the people in there who would more likely be naturally supportive of our measure to the polls. And so this meant that our strategy could focus on getting out the vote of those people, and it's more cost effective and allows us to focus less on persuasion, which, as I said before, is very difficult. Next slide. So now that I've kind of gone over how to use the election year you want and why we chose 2015, I want to talk about what did happen in 2014, because there was quite a significant amount of work that happened in that year to prepare for a 2015 levy. Next slide. So throughout the year 2014, a significant amount of time was spent, as I said, in conversations and negotiations with the city to set up this 2015 levy for success. The conservation community wanted this levy to have a more comprehensive scope than the first Boise levy did. For an example, we wanted to expand the criteria to include lands throughout Boise that met conservation requirements, and for the funds to be able to be used for habitat restoration and trail improvements. We also wanted the funds to be able to be used to purchase land by the Boise River and be used for water quality improvements. Protecting the Boise River needed to be included in the effort, and that was something that we needed to negotiate with the city and make sure was in the ballot language. And so if we wanted to add all of these new elements, we also had to be sure that the city could implement these funds once they were attained. And so this required us to partner with them and determine together what was possible. We also found in these conversations that the city wanted quite a bit of flexibility with these funds, while we as the conservation community wanted more restrictions that determined upfront what they could be used for. As an example of that, the conservation community wanted to ensure that none of the levy funds could be used on projects to come into compliance with the Clean Water Act, since these were obligations that the city already had to meet. We also wanted to make sure that there was a citizens advisory committee formed to oversee the funds, so that there was transparency and the ability for input from the committee as to how these funds would be used. And furthermore, before we invested in polling to see if we should even run a levy, which I'm sure many of you know can be quite expensive, the poll that we conducted cost close to $20,000. Before we did that, we wanted to have some guarantee that the ballot language used in the poll would be as close as possible as what actually appeared on the ballot to give it the greatest amount of accuracy as possible so that we knew what was going to happen in the election. And then finally, the city also helped us calculate what the tax per month to the average homeowner would be based on property taxes. And this was obviously critical in helping us determine how much money could actually be raised from a levy. And so that we were able to negotiate and have a common understanding with the city, ensure that the campaign was successful. And I want to emphasize that this early groundwork was really important to the success we saw and that high support number, that 74% support number. And then a lot of time went into making sure that this was set up properly. We were also aided by the fact that we had support from our mayor and city council. Next slide. So during the tail end of these negotiations, once we felt like we had a pretty solid understanding of what this could look like with the city, there was a coalition of 5 conservation groups in Boise that came together to conduct polling to learn if a levy would be viable and know more about our electorate. These groups served as an advisory committee throughout the campaign, and we pooled our resources financially together to get that poll. Next slide. So we conducted polling during a 3-day survey at the end of March 2015, and we actually hired a firm that went out and interviewed 400 likely voters in the city via telephone. We used a voter file sample, which was diminished to reflect the November 2015 electorate, going back to when I talked about the difference between those election years. And that was our polling universe. And we used the America Votes database to do that. And so from that poll, we learned a lot about how to proceed, especially about our messaging and price sensitivity. For instance, we learned that our initial starting support numbers diminished by 10% by adding an additional $2 million to the levy. So if we were to pursue a $12 million levy versus a $10 million levy, we had it was 10% less likely to succeed. We also learned important language differentials, like how preserving open space versus natural areas performed with voters, or wildlife habitat versus fish and wildlife habitat. Well, apparently people really don't like when you throw fish in there. It actually decreased our numbers. We didn't know that before we started this. What more is that we learned that wonky conservation arguments on why we should do this did not work with our electorate, nor did using negatives such as the threat of encroaching development or the threat of fire. These actually harmed our likelihood of success. What we did learn from the polling is that Boiseans are really proud of our city and our open space legacy. Basically, people who live in Boise think Boise is awesome, and that's absolutely true. If you ever get the chance to visit here, I strongly encourage it. And so the polling showed that when we reiterated that Boise is awesome and that we have a chance to make it even more awesome, people bought in. And so that's where our campaign slogan, I Love Boise, came from. You can see that logo on our t-shirts in this picture. Those were our campaign t-shirts that we sold throughout the campaign, and that was the logo we used through all of our messaging. And so finally from the poll, we knew that we have a starting majority of 60% of voters in favor for a levy for conservation funding. And had this number been too low, probably for our campaign it would have been anything under 45%, we would most likely not have proceeded forward with a levy. That threshold is something that you need to determine if you are considering a similar funding measure. And it's important when you're determining your threshold that you keep in mind that almost any ballot measure contest, but particularly those involving taxes, those initially undecided voters in your polling are going to break towards the no side in much greater numbers than they do towards the yes side. So give yourself a cushion when you're determining that threshold to get to your success number. Now, also importantly in polling, we learned who our target voters should be. Next slide. So when we started this campaign, we already knew up front that we wanted to run a super targeted campaign that identified who our people were in the likely electorate and then work to turn them out. We were going to focus heavily on GOTV or get out the vote efforts. And all other voters who didn't fit in this framework would essentially be ignored by the campaign because we really didn't need them to win. When we looked at our polling, it showed that we had natural support out there. We just had to make sure they get to the polls. But it was important to know who our voter was. And so we learned from that polling that, like many issues today, this one was split down partisan lines, with Democrats or people more likely to vote Democratic supporting the levy. Additionally, people who recreate in the foothills or have kids were more likely to vote with us, as were women and younger people between the ages of 18 to 50. So we then took this information and used it to identify voters in the voter action database so that we would target those people explicitly who we thought would be with us on this issue. Next slide. And so that brings us to our win number, which is really a critical piece of information for you to know when you're launching a campaign, because it's what you're going to set all of your goals around. And on this slide are our predicted numbers at the very start of our campaign. And so at the time, up at the top there, Boise had just over 111,000 registered voters. And we then derived the predicted turnout universe from past electoral trends and individual level voting history, which is available to you. And we used the formula that we came up with to determine that turnout would be, we could predict it to be at 23.5% in the year 2015. And so that gave us the number of votes that would likely be cast. We also knew that our threshold to pass a levy in Idaho is 50% plus 1. And so by doing basic math, we knew that we needed 13,089 votes to win. So that's what we set all of our campaign plans and goals around, is that number, that 13,000 number. And so we built a targeted universe that identified those likely municipal voters who were likely to be supportive or persuadable, and also people who were strongly likely to be with us, but not reliable voters. So those people that we could concentrate those GOTV and getting out the vote efforts on. And so just one more note about our win number. We did learn, we launched this campaign in June of 2015, and in August, the mayor who was on the ballot for that year did pull a viable component. And so we actually increased our predicted voter turnout at that time to just about 31%. And then we adjusted our campaign to match that. So just so you guys know, once you set these numbers, if something happens that changes what the turnout could be, you should adjust accordingly. Next slide. So that year on June 9th, the City Council voted to put the levy on the ballot through a resolution. There are different ways in different areas that a levy or a bond can be put on the ballot, but we did it through a resolution. And it was after that point that we've formed an official campaign. And so for those of you who might be listening in from 501c3 nonprofits, I hope your legal ears perked up a little bit when you heard the word partisan earlier. The fact that we had to target Democrats, on the fact that they're indeed Democrats, could have introduced some legal issues with how 501c3s could be connected to the campaign. However, we created a structure to avoid this. Conservation Voters for Idaho, the organization that actually formed Boise for Clean Water and Open Space and ran the campaign as a 501c4. And so legally we're allowed to work in elections like this. We also created Boise for Clean Water and Open Space as its own independent entity that was registered as a political action committee or a PAC with the state of Idaho. And this structure is important for me to talk about because it gave us much greater flexibility to target voters and actually work in the election. So a lot of the tactics that we used were allowed because of this framework that we created. And there are some negatives to this type of a structure. One of them being that donations to the campaign are not tax deductible, and that the 501c3s that worked with us on this campaign were limited by their legal lobbying limits as to how much they could contribute both financially and in kind. Those 501c3s were also required to report all of their spending related to the campaign to Boise for Clean Water and Open Space, and then the campaign, the report to the Secretary of State. However, based on how targeted the structure allows us to be in our voter contact efforts, there's absolutely no way that I would do this any other way. In my opinion, the negatives were dismal in comparison to the strength and the flexibility that it lent to the campaign. And you know what? Fundraising was pretty easy even with those tax deductions. Businesses really like to support initiatives like this. It gives them really good PR in the community, and they can also see the results quickly on a known timeline because it is a campaign and there is an election that's going to determine your success or failure. Next slide. So with our campaign structure set, we needed to figure out how we were going to actually get to victory. And so we got together and we built an ideal campaign plan for what we wanted to do that included voter contact efforts and a GOTV plan. And these were really our two big focuses throughout the campaign. So obviously, disseminating our message and making our case to Boise voters was the most important task of the campaign. Through prior experience in national studies, we know that the most effective way to do this is through direct contact with voters through personal conversations about the levy. And we had to stick to that proven language from the polling about making Boise an even better place to live. Our voter contact efforts really focused on door-to-door canvasses where both volunteers and paid staff informed targeted voters about the measure, and then we tracked their level of support so we could follow up with them closer to the election. We did run a mail campaign aimed at our targeted voters, and this consisted of 3 major mail pieces. They were an absentee ballot request, an early vote and informational piece, and a social pressure letter. And each of these pieces were designed based on research on how to make them the most effective. For instance, our absentee ballot request mailer was designed to look like it came from the government itself. It was not flashy, it didn't have nice pictures of the foothills or anything on it, and it didn't talk at all about the levy. The informational mailer was the only mail we did that actually talked about the levy. And the focus was really pretty minimal, as the language was more targeted towards getting people to vote early. So just returning to our polling conversation so we can talk, so you guys know how much that influenced this whole campaign. We knew that if we sent those mailers to our targeted voters, we really already had the support we needed. We just needed them to actually go and cast their ballot. The second key campaign element was a very early tactical decision to focus on getting out the vote. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, but we did this because of the polling. And we knew we had that strong universe that was sufficient to pass the levy. So basically, again, if we could turn out our people, we would have the numbers to win. And so how we did GOTV was we used phones as the primary method to push our voters out to the polls the weekend and the day of the election. And once again, we used tested techniques like vote planning to maximize voter participation during these efforts. And so for those of you who don't know what vote planning is, when you have a voter on the phone, you actually walk them through how they're going to vote by asking them the questions like, do you know where your polling place is? Do you know how you're going to get there? What time are you planning to go? And so studies show that these improve the rates of that voters going to turn out pretty dramatically, and it's really worth the time that it takes your volunteers or your paid staff members to have that conversation with them to get them to the polls. And finally, once we had the campaign plan set and we knew what tactics we were going to take and what our universe of voters looked like, we created a budget for what that would cost us, and we created a fundraising plan off of that. And I think the fundraising strategy was really key to this plan. We had a campaign budget of roughly $175,000, so it was not an insignificant cost. And we started that as soon as we knew that the levy would be on the ballot. And we were able to hit our fundraising goal by mid-October, which allowed us to implement every aspect of our campaign plan, both on time, which was important when you're talking about such a firm deadline as an election. And it also allowed campaign staff and resources to be fully focused on engaging the electorate instead of raising last-minute dollars to fund this. Next slide. So I do want to mention that we did have several events throughout the campaign, including a campaign kickoff party, which was very public, neighborhood parties, house parties, and organization-hosted parties by some of the groups involved in the levy. We had learned, I was also involved in the 2013 bond efforts, and we learned in that campaign that it's really important to bring the community together and create a sense of unity, especially for organizations that are going to be around after the election. It's great to build up your members and to make this longer lasting conservation community. But I do want to emphasize that these events are not useful for actually influencing voters or turning people out to the polls. You'll have a lot of people who attend these events that aren't registered voters, and you can certainly try to register them. But if you have limited resources, you should be focusing on contacting voters directly and getting them to vote for your initiative. Next slide. So really the campaign spent the month from July through November executing our campaign plans. We were very fortunate. We didn't face any organized opposition, and everything went to plan, which is sort of a miracle. I've been involved in a few campaigns at this point in time, and usually something pops up. So I do not advise for planning for perfect, but if you run everything on track to your plan, you should have some flexibility in there to adjust when something goes wrong. Next slide. So I included this slide just to give you guys a scope, kind of the scale of what we did. By the end of the campaign, we had knocked on almost 30,000 doors and identified approximately 6,500 people there. We'd also made over 15,000 phone calls and identified 5,500 people there. So in total, we have identified over 12,000 voters at the end of the campaign who were likely to be with us. So we were a little short of actually finding our total support number, that win number that I talked about earlier. But we knew going into the election that we had a really strong chance of having all the votes we needed. Next slide. So what are the takeaways from this campaign that you should be considering if you are considering a funding initiative like this in your own community? This was the second successful levy for conservation funding in Boise, but that doesn't mean it was easy. This was only the third effort of its kind to pass in Idaho. And many of you might know that this is a very conservative state, and we were asking voters to tax themselves to protect the environment. So nothing that we did in this campaign was random. We did not want to take another chance that we would fail. So we lined all of our decks up. We conducted early research to learn about our electorate and implemented what we learned from polling into our campaign plan, voter contact efforts, and messaging. Even when that was hard. I mean, as conservationists, we really like to talk about why the environment is so important and argue that way, but we knew that that wasn't a winning argument. We had to talk about people loving Boise and making it a better place to live. We focused on direct voter contact. These person-to-person conversations make a big difference when campaigning. And we only had these conversations with our targeted voters. We did not have them with a broader universe. We were aggressive in our fundraising efforts and able to secure the funds needed to execute our plans early, which was very key to making sure everything could run to plan. And looking back at this, it's fairly impressive that almost everything went right for us on this campaign. And I know that would be difficult to replicate, and I'm not advocating for perfection because it's not necessary to pass a conservation funding measure. All you need to do is reach that win number that I talk about. So if you have a well-planned campaign and you've done your research ahead of time and you know that you have initial support, we can win a lot more funding initiatives like this for conservation in the U.S. So now I take questions if anybody out there has questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate you giving that great overview of the really successful campaign that you led, I guess it was about a year ago now. So at this point, feel free to ask any questions that you might have. We've got a few in the question box now. So let's go ahead and take 2 questions, and then we will, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, have a transcript of all of the asked questions available on Monday, July 25th, next Monday, of all the questions that were asked, as well as a recorded version of this webinar. So Kate, the first question that I'll ask you is, who were some of the challenges, what were some of the challenges in terms of the voters that you had who were not necessarily supportive of the levy initiative? And how did you address them?
Yeah, so we actually, so we knew that the people who were most likely not to support this levy were Republicans. They were older, and many of them were white males. That's really what the polling showed us. But it showed us that we had the support numbers in those people who were supportive of us. And so we did not have to target people who were opposed to it at all. And so our campaign, we just didn't target them at all. We partialed them out of our voter universe so they wouldn't receive any of our targeted phone calls or our mailers. And we didn't do any wide universe broadcasting. So we didn't put things in the newspaper like advertisements for the levy and encouraging people to vote. We didn't go on the radio. We didn't go on TV. Essentially what we did was we ignored that universe and went after the voters that were likely to be supportive of this measure.
Great. That's awesome. Thank you. And then the last question that we'll have, just because of time, is Who did you work with to draft the language that you ended up including with the levy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The city members that we worked with really closely on this in the year 2014 were the City of Boise has an environmental manager. We also worked with the government relations staff member and then the mayor and his staff. But the key person in all of this was the city attorney's office. And so we worked with them to identify, what legally we had to say in the language, and then picked out between our conversations with those other members of the city, that being the environmental manager and the mayor's office, the other things we wanted to have included in that. So when we knew we wanted to make this a wider, a more broad levy that included other areas of Boise, that included water quality protections, we proposed language to them. They tweaked it around, and the attorney really told us if we could legally put it in there and how it had to be framed for that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kate. So with that, just being cognizant of time, it is about 5 minutes after 11:30, so I will go ahead and close off the questions for now. But as I mentioned, a transcript of all of the questions will be available along with the recorded webinar on the Blue Trails Guide blog, bluetrailsguide.org/blog, next Monday, July 25th. So be sure to check that out. I will also email the link around to everybody next week. And I did want to just make a quick plug for our webinar next month, our August Blue Trails Guide webinar, which will be on Tuesday, August 23rd at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will be joined by American River staff member Wendy McDermott, who will be talking with us about the recreation and conservation planning initiative that she has been working on the Nooksack River in the state of Washington. So please check the Blue Trails Guide website for more information about that. And thank you all for attending the webinar today. And a big thank you to Kate for presenting such a fantastic webinar for all of us. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you all back next month. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Thanks all.
Thank you, Faye.